January 8, 1943. Stalingrad, Soviet Union. Gefreiter Klaus Weber huddled in a bombed-out basement with 47 other soldiers from his company, trying to survive another night of temperatures that had dropped to minus 42 degrees Celsius. The basement offered no heat. There was no fuel for fires. The wooden boards they had torn from ruined buildings to burn had been exhausted days ago. Weber wore every piece of clothing he possessed. His uniform, a stolen Soviet greatcoat taken from a corpse, newspapers stuffed inside his jacket as insulation, rags wrapped around his feet inside boots that had frozen solid. His hands were black with frostbite. He could no longer feel his toes and suspected they were already dead tissue that would need to be amputated if he somehow survived. Around him, men sat pressed together for warmth, shivering uncontrollably, some delirious with hypothermia, a few already dead, but still sitting upright because their bodies had frozen in position, and because the living lacked the strength to move the corpses. Outside, the wind howled across the rubble of what had once been Stalingrad, driving snow horizontally through the ruins, creating wind chill that made the already deadly temperature even more lethal. Weber had been in Stalingrad since September 1942, when the German Sixth Army had begun its assault on the city. The battle that was supposed to last weeks had stretched into months of the most brutal urban combat in military history. By November, German forces controlled 90% of the city. Victory seemed certain. Then, on November 19th, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that struck German flanks north and south of Stalingrad. Within 4 days, Soviet pincers had closed around the city, trapping the entire Sixth Army and parts of other German units, approximately 300,000 soldiers, in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. The encirclement created a catastrophe that would become one of the worst military disasters in history. The trapped German forces needed massive daily supplies to survive and continue fighting. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler that his air force could supply the encircled army by air, delivering 500 tons of supplies daily. The promise was fantasy. The Luftwaffe never came close to delivering adequate supplies. Most days, the airlift delivered less than 100 tons. Many days, weather prevented any flights at all. The inadequate supplies meant that soldiers in the pocket were slowly starving and freezing while fighting a Soviet army that was growing stronger daily as reinforcements arrived and as Soviet forces tightened the noose around the German pocket. Weber's company had been reduced from 180 men in September to fewer than 50 by early January. Most losses had come from combat, but increasing numbers were dying from cold, starvation, and disease. The rations had been reduced repeatedly as supply situation worsened. By January, soldiers were receiving perhaps 100 grams of bread per day, and watery soup made from whatever could be scavenged. Horses that had pulled artillery were slaughtered and eaten. Rats were caught and cooked. Some soldiers were eating corpses, cutting frozen flesh from the dead to survive another day. The cold was worse than the hunger. The winter of 1942-43 was one of the coldest in decades. Temperatures dropped below minus 30 regularly and reached minus 40 or lower during the worst periods. German soldiers had not been issued adequate winter clothing because Hitler and the High Command had expected the Soviet Union to collapse before winter and had not prepared for sustained winter operations. The uniforms German soldiers wore were designed for temperate European climates. They provided inadequate insulation against Russian winter. Soldiers improvised desperately, stuffing newspapers inside jackets, wrapping themselves in blankets taken from Soviet civilians, stealing coats from Soviet dead. But these measures were insufficient against the brutal cold. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties by January. Thousands of soldiers could no longer walk because their feet were frozen. Thousands had lost fingers to frostbite, making it impossible to hold weapons or perform basic tasks. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with frostbite cases, but there was nothing doctors could do except amputate dead tissue without anesthesia, because medical supplies were exhausted. The fuel shortage was critical. Vehicles could not operate without fuel. Tanks sat immobile, useful only as static pillboxes. Trucks could not distribute what little supplies arrived by air. Most critically, there was no fuel for heating. Buildings could not be heated. Soldiers could not light fires without wood or coal, and both were scarce in the rubble of destroyed Stalingrad. The combination of extreme cold, inadequate shelter, no heating fuel, and insufficient food created conditions where soldiers froze to death by the hundreds every night. The night of January 8 to 9, 1943, was among the worst. Weather reports from German and Soviet sources indicate temperatures dropped to -42 degrees Celsius, with strong winds creating wind chill around -50. A massive storm system had moved across the region, bringing the coldest temperatures of the winter up to that point. The storm had also prevented Luftwaffe supply flights, meaning no food or supplies had arrived for 2 days. Soldiers were weakened by hunger, weakened by months of combat stress, weakened by diseases spreading through the unsanitary conditions in the pocket, and now faced the coldest night of the winter without adequate shelter, clothing, or fuel. Klaus Weber had watched the temperature drop throughout the day on January 8th. His company had retreated to the basement after Soviet artillery had destroyed the building they had been defending. The basement was partially collapsed, but offered more shelter than remaining in the open. 48 men crowded into the space, sitting pressed against each other, trying to share body heat. Some men were wounded, their bandages frozen to their wounds. Some were delirious with fever from infections. All were malnourished and exhausted. Weber knew many would not survive the night. He had seen it before during previous cold nights. Men would fall asleep and simply not wake up, their bodies shutting down from hypothermia. The critical temperature for hypothermia death is around -40 degrees, and they were already below that. As darkness fell on January 8th, the temperature continued dropping. The wind intensified, finding every gap in the ruined building above them, driving freezing air into the basement. Men huddled closer together, forming a mass of shivering bodies. Some men talked, trying to stay awake because falling asleep in these conditions meant death. They talked about home, about families, about food they remembered eating, about warm summer days that seemed impossibly distant now. Some men prayed, Catholic and Protestant prayers mixing together in the darkness. Some men cried quietly. Some had already retreated into themselves, sitting silently, staring at nothing, too exhausted to care whether they survived the night. Weber tried to stay alert. He had learned that movement helped maintain body temperature, but movement required energy that starving bodies did not have. He shifted position occasionally, flexed his fingers despite the pain from frostbite, stomped his feet to encourage circulation, even though he could not feel them anymore. He watched the men around him, noting who seemed to be losing consciousness, trying to shake them awake when they started to slip away, because once someone lost consciousness in these temperatures, they rarely regained it. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Weber had no watch, and could not see the stars through the storm, so he had no way to know what time it was or how much longer until dawn. Time became meaningless, measured only by the increasing numbness spreading through his body and by the number of men who stopped moving and stopped responding to attempts to wake them. Around what Weber estimated was midnight, based on how long darkness had lasted, several men began showing severe hypothermia symptoms. They became confused, trying to remove their clothing because severe hypothermia creates sensation of burning heat that makes victims feel they need to cool down by stripping. Other soldiers restrained them, forcing their clothing back on, trying to prevent them from exposing themselves to the cold. Some men began hallucinating, seeing things that were not there, talking to people who were not present. Weber heard one soldier having a conversation with his mother, describing a meal she was cooking, thanking her for the warm blanket she was bringing him. The soldier was lucid for a moment, realized he had been hallucinating, and began crying before lapsing back into delirium. The deaths began increasing after midnight. Men who had been sitting upright slumped over and could not be roused. Weber checked pulses when possible, finding some men had died, while others were so deeply unconscious that their pulses were barely detectable, and their breathing had slowed to the point of being imperceptible. The bodies could not be moved outside because the living lacked the strength to carry them, and because the bodies had begun freezing in position. The dead remained sitting among the living, indistinguishable in the darkness, except that they no longer shivered and no longer responded to attempts to wake them. Weber himself felt consciousness slipping at times. He would find himself staring at nothing, thoughts becoming confused, feeling almost comfortable despite knowing he was freezing to death. He forced himself to move, to think, to remember why he wanted to survive. He thought about his wife Maria and his daughter Greta, ages 7, living in Munich. He had not received mail for weeks because the airlift was not bringing mail, only minimal supplies. He did not know whether they knew he was trapped in Stalingrad or whether they still believed he was winning the war in Russia. He wanted to see them again. That desire was the only thing keeping him alert when his body wanted to shut down and die. The wind outside reached peak intensity around 2 a.m. based on Weber's estimate. The howling became deafening. Snow forced its way into the basement through cracks and holes. The temperature, if possible, seemed to drop even further. This was the crisis point. Weber could feel men around him giving up, their shivering stopping, their bodies relaxing into death. He tried to keep moving, but his movements were becoming slower and weaker. He could no longer feel most of his body. His thoughts were fragmenting. He began to understand that he was probably going to die this night, that his body could not survive much longer under these conditions. He felt surprisingly peaceful about it. Death seemed easier than continuing to fight the cold. The alternative to dying was surviving only to face another identical night, and another, until he died anyway, or until he was killed by Soviet forces that were methodically destroying the German pocket. Death seemed merciful. Weber lost consciousness at some point during the early morning hours. His last memory was of the darkness and the cold and the wind and thinking about his daughter. He did not expect to wake again. He woke because he was being shaken violently. Light was coming through gaps in the ceiling. It was dawn, January 9th. A sergeant was moving through the basement, checking who was alive and who was dead. The sergeant reached Weber, found he was still breathing, and shook him awake. Weber tried to speak, but his mouth would not work properly. His jaw was frozen. His tongue felt too large. He managed to nod to indicate he was conscious. The sergeant moved on to check other soldiers. Weber looked around the basement as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Bodies were everywhere. Most of the men who had been in the basement when night fell were now dead. He counted quickly. Perhaps 15 men were moving or responding to the sergeant. That meant at least 33 had died during the night. The bodies sat frozen in the positions they had died in, some slumped against walls, some leaning on each other, some still sitting upright as if they were merely sleeping. The scene was surreal and horrible. Weber tried to stand, but his legs would not support him. 2 other soldiers helped him to his feet. They half-carried him up the stairs from the basement into the ruins above. Outside, the wind had died down, but the temperature remained brutally cold. The sun was rising over the destroyed city, illuminating a landscape that looked like hell frozen over. Stalingrad had been reduced to ruins by months of fighting and by German bombing before the battle began. Every building was damaged or destroyed. The ground was covered with snow mixed with rubble, shell craters, unexploded ordnance, and corpses. Bodies were everywhere. German and Soviet soldiers killed in recent fighting, their bodies freezing where they fell because nobody had strength or time to bury them. The bodies from the night's cold were adding to the count. Across the German pocket, the same scene Weber had experienced in his basement had played out in thousands of other locations. Soldiers sheltering in ruins, in trenches, in bunkers, had frozen to death by the thousands during the night of January 8-9. The exact number who died that night cannot be determined with certainty, because German record-keeping had broken down and because many units were so fragmented that nobody maintained accurate casualty counts anymore. Estimates from survivors and from German records compiled after the war suggest between 15,000 and 20,000 German soldiers died from cold-related causes during that single night. The estimate is based on daily strength reports showing the Sixth Army's effective strength dropped by approximately 20,000 between January 8th and January 10th, with most of that loss attributed to cold exposure rather than to combat, because fighting had been limited during the storm. The loss of 20,000 men in one night represented catastrophic attrition that exceeded anything the German army had experienced previously in a single day without major combat. For comparison, the bloodiest day of German losses during World War I was at Verdun, where approximately 10,000 Germans were killed in one day of intense fighting. The Stalingrad freeze killed twice that many without a shot being fired. The deaths continued through the following days as men who had survived the night with severe hypothermia and frostbite succumbed to their injuries. Weber was among the survivors, but his condition was critical. Both feet were frozen solid. His hands were badly frostbitten. He was evacuated to a field hospital, a basement where overwhelmed doctors triaged the hundreds of frostbite casualties flooding in. The doctor who examined Weber told him both feet would need to be amputated to prevent gangrene from spreading and killing him. There was no anesthesia. Weber was held down by 4 soldiers, while a doctor sawed through frozen flesh and bone with a surgical saw. Weber passed out from pain partway through the procedure, which was mercy. He woke hours later, legless, lying on a floor, covered with other amputees, some screaming, some unconscious, some dead. The hospital had no beds, minimal supplies, and no heat. Patients lay on the floor wrapped in whatever blankets or coats could be found. Medical staff did what they could, which was almost nothing. The psychological impact of the freeze night on survivors was profound and lasting. Men who survived watched friends and comrades freeze to death around them, unable to help, unable even to share body heat effectively because everyone was on the edge of death. The randomness of who survived and who died. Sometimes the man sitting next to you would die while you survived, despite having similar clothing and similar physical condition, created survivors' guilt that haunted men for decades. The realization that they had been abandoned by their leadership to freeze to death in a hopeless situation created rage and disillusionment that destroyed whatever belief in the Nazi regime or in German military leadership had sustained them through years of war. The broader context of the Stalingrad encirclement explains how the catastrophe of the freeze night was possible, and why soldiers were left in conditions where mass death from cold was inevitable. The German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus had been ordered to capture Stalingrad in summer 1942 as part of Operation Blue. The German offensive aimed at capturing the Caucasus oil fields. Stalingrad itself had limited strategic importance, but Hitler had become fixated on capturing the city that bore Stalin's name for symbolic and propaganda reasons. The battle for the city became grinding urban warfare where German forces advanced block by block through months of brutal fighting that destroyed the city and that inflicted terrible casualties on both sides. By November, German forces controlled most of Stalingrad, but the Soviet defenders had not been eliminated. The Soviet counteroffensive Operation Uranus exploited German overextension and the weakness of German flanks, which were held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units that were less well-equipped and less motivated than German troops. The Soviet pincer movement broke through the flanks and encircled the Sixth Army in the Stalingrad pocket before German forces could react effectively. General Paulus requested permission to break out of the encirclement immediately, while the Soviet encirclement was still relatively weak. Hitler refused. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad and promised that Göring's Luftwaffe would supply the army by air until German forces outside the pocket could break through and relieve the encirclement. Both promises proved false. The Luftwaffe could not supply an entire army by air under winter conditions with Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire contesting the supply route. The relief attempts by German forces outside the pocket failed to break through Soviet defenses and were called off after making minimal progress. The Sixth Army was left trapped, undersupplied, and facing a Soviet force that grew stronger daily while German forces grew weaker. Hitler's refusal to authorize breakout or withdrawal doomed the Sixth Army. Military historians have debated for decades whether the Sixth Army could have broken out successfully if Paulus had attempted it immediately after the encirclement, or if Hitler had authorized it. The consensus is that breakout would have been extremely difficult and would have required abandoning all heavy equipment and wounded soldiers, but that it was probably feasible in late November before the Soviets solidified their lines and before German forces were weakened by cold and starvation. By December, breakout had become impossible. The Sixth Army lacked the fuel to move its vehicles, lacked the strength to march long distances, and faced Soviet forces that were prepared to annihilate any breakout attempt. The soldiers in the pocket were trapped, and they knew they were doomed. The supply situation in the pocket deteriorated rapidly through December and into January. The Luftwaffe was losing transport aircraft at unsustainable rates to Soviet fighters, to anti-aircraft fire, and to weather-related crashes. The airfields in the pocket were under constant Soviet artillery fire and were being overrun as the pocket shrank. The tonnage delivered dropped week by week. Rations were cut repeatedly. By January, soldiers were receiving starvation rations that provided perhaps 800 calories per day, less than half what a soldier needed for basic survival, even without considering the additional calories required for fighting and for staying warm in extreme cold. Soldiers were literally starving to death while simultaneously freezing. The combination was deadly. Starvation weakens the body's ability to generate heat. Starving people become hypothermic at higher temperatures than well-nourished people. The German soldiers in Stalingrad were starving and therefore were vulnerable to hypothermia at temperatures that would not normally be lethal. Their bodies lacked the calories to generate heat. Their immune systems were compromised, making them vulnerable to infections. Their mental capacity was diminished, making them less able to take protective measures or to recognize hypothermia symptoms in themselves. The starvation made the cold deadlier, and the cold made the starvation deadlier, creating a death spiral that killed thousands. The leadership failures that created the Stalingrad catastrophe extended from Hitler at the top through the entire German command structure. Hitler's refusal to authorize breakout was the fundamental strategic error. His insistence that the Sixth Army hold Stalingrad, despite the impossibility of the situation, was based on ideological rigidity and on refusal to admit that his strategy had failed. Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could supply the army was based on wishful thinking rather than on realistic assessment of capabilities. The promise gave Hitler justification for refusing breakout and therefore made the catastrophe possible. General Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, failed to disobey Hitler's orders when disobedience might have saved his army. German military culture emphasized obedience to superior orders, and Paulus was unwilling to act contrary to Hitler's explicit commands, even when those commands were clearly leading to his army's destruction. The tragedy was compounded because Paulus knew the situation was hopeless, but continued to follow orders that he knew were killing his men. The Soviet perspective on the freeze night illustrates the battle's brutality affected both sides, though Soviet forces were better prepared for winter conditions. Soviet soldiers were issued winter clothing that was far superior to German equipment. Soviet forces had supplies of firewood and coal for heating. Soviet logistics were operating normally, while German logistics had collapsed. But Soviet soldiers fighting in Stalingrad still suffered terribly from cold. Thousands of Soviet soldiers also died from cold-related causes during the winter, though in smaller numbers than German losses because Soviets had better equipment and adequate supplies. The Soviet command was aware that German forces in the pocket were suffering catastrophic cold casualties. Soviet intelligence reports from interrogations of German prisoners and from monitoring German radio traffic indicated that German forces were losing thousands of men to cold and starvation. The Soviet strategy was to allow these conditions to weaken German resistance before launching the final offensive to eliminate the pocket. The cold was doing the Soviets' work for them, killing Germans without Soviet forces needing to attack. The wait-and-starve strategy minimized Soviet casualties while maximizing German losses. The propaganda dimensions of the Stalingrad disaster were significant for both sides. The Nazis initially portrayed the battle as heroic defense of Stalingrad against overwhelming Soviet forces. German propaganda emphasized the courage and determination of German soldiers holding the city. The propaganda could not acknowledge the reality that German soldiers were freezing and starving to death in a pocket that their own leadership's mistakes had created. Soviet propaganda used Stalingrad as symbol of Soviet resistance and of ultimate Soviet victory over fascism. The battle became cornerstone of Soviet World War II mythology, representing the turning point where the seemingly unstoppable German advance was halted and reversed. The freeze night and the suffering of German soldiers in the pocket were used in Soviet propaganda to demonstrate the inevitable defeat of fascist aggression. The humanitarian questions raised by the freeze night and by the Stalingrad pocket generally include whether Soviet forces had any obligation to offer humanitarian assistance or to allow evacuation of wounded German soldiers. International law and military custom in that era did not clearly require combatants to assist trapped enemy forces, especially when those forces had invaded the country and had committed widespread atrocities against civilians. Soviet forces at Stalingrad were under no obligation to help Germans who were freezing and starving in the pocket that they themselves had created through their invasion. The Soviet perspective was that Germans had brought their suffering on themselves, and that allowing Germans to suffer and die reduced the number of Germans who would continue fighting. The perspective was harsh, but was consistent with the total war that was being fought, and with the atrocities Germans had committed against Soviet civilians and prisoners during their invasion. Klaus Weber survived the amputation and survived for 3 more weeks in the field hospital despite conditions that killed many amputees from infection and from continued cold exposure. In late January, as Soviet forces tightened their grip on the pocket, and as German resistance began collapsing, Weber was among thousands of wounded German soldiers who were captured when the Soviets overran the hospital. The capture probably saved his life, because Soviet captivity, as terrible as it was, provided marginally better conditions than remaining in the German pocket, where death from cold or starvation was certain. Weber spent the next 10 years in Soviet prison camps, returning to Germany in 1953 as part of prisoner releases following Stalin's death. He returned without legs, weighing less than 50 kilograms, suffering from tuberculosis and from malnutrition-related health problems that would affect him for the rest of his life. But he returned alive, which made him fortunate compared to most men who had been in Stalingrad. Of the approximately 90,000 German soldiers who surrendered when the pocket finally collapsed in early February 1943, only about 5,000 ever returned to Germany. Most died in Soviet captivity from starvation, disease, overwork, and cold. Weber's return allowed him to reunite with his wife and daughter after 11 years. His daughter Greta, who had been 7 when he left for war, was 18 and did not initially recognize her father. The reunion was difficult because Weber was physically and psychologically damaged by his experiences. He suffered from nightmares about the freeze night for the rest of his life, waking screaming about the cold and about the frozen bodies. He developed severe depression and alcoholism. He was unable to work because of his physical disabilities and because of his psychological trauma. His family life was strained by his difficulties adapting to peacetime and by the trauma that haunted him. Weber's story was typical of Stalingrad survivors. The men who returned from Stalingrad and from Soviet captivity carried physical and psychological scars that never healed. Many were missing limbs from frostbite amputations. Many suffered from chronic health problems resulting from starvation and from diseases contracted in the pocket or in captivity. Many suffered from what would now be diagnosed as severe PTSD, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, depression, and inability to function normally in civilian life. The Stalingrad survivors were marked men, set apart from other veterans by the extremity of what they had experienced and by the knowledge that they had survived what most of their comrades had not. The statistical dimensions of the Stalingrad disaster illustrate the magnitude of the catastrophe. The German Sixth Army that entered the Stalingrad pocket in November 1942 numbered approximately 250,000 to 290,000 soldiers. Estimates vary based on different counting methods. By the time the pocket surrendered in early February 1943, approximately 90,000 remained alive to be captured. This means that approximately 160,000 to 200,000 German soldiers died in the pocket during the roughly 10 weeks of encirclement. Of those who died, estimates suggest that roughly 50,000 died in combat from Soviet attacks and from the fighting to reduce the pocket. The remaining 110,000 to 150,000 died from cold, starvation, disease, or from wounds that would have been survivable with adequate medical care, but that were fatal in the conditions prevailing in the pocket. The night of January 8-9, when 15,000 to 20,000 died, represents roughly 15% of total non-combat deaths, occurring in a single 24-hour period, illustrating the catastrophic impact of that particular cold snap. The demographic impact on Germany was significant because Stalingrad destroyed an entire field army. The soldiers who died were mostly young men of prime fighting age. The loss removed approximately 300,000 men from Germany's available manpower, representing several years' worth of draftees. The loss occurred at a time when Germany was already stretched thin fighting on multiple fronts, and when manpower was becoming critical constraint on Germany's ability to continue the war. The loss at Stalingrad, combined with other defeats in late 1942 and early 1943, marked the beginning of Germany's strategic decline, and the point where the war became unwinnable for Germany. The strategic impact was even greater than the numerical loss might suggest, because the Sixth Army had been one of Germany's best and most experienced formations. The loss of so much combat experience and so many trained soldiers could not be easily replaced. The propaganda and morale impact within Germany was severe. The Nazi regime could not hide the loss of an entire army. Families of missing soldiers eventually learned that their sons and husbands were missing at Stalingrad. The regime tried to portray Stalingrad as heroic sacrifice, as German soldiers fighting to the last bullet. But the reality that emerged from survivors was that soldiers had frozen and starved to death because of Hitler's refusal to authorize breakout. The truth about Stalingrad undermined faith in Nazi leadership and created widespread disillusionment that the regime could not suppress despite its propaganda efforts. The military lessons from Stalingrad influenced how both sides conducted operations for the remainder of the war. The Germans learned that encirclement did not necessarily lead to quick victory if the encircled force could be supplied, and if the encircling force was strong enough to maintain the encirclement. They learned that winter operations in Russia required far better preparation and far better logistics than they had provided. They learned that Hitler's refusal to authorize tactical withdrawals could lead to catastrophic losses. These lessons came too late to change the war's outcome, but they influenced German defensive operations in subsequent years. The Soviets learned that their strategy of encirclement, followed by systematic destruction of the pocket, was effective and should be repeated. They learned that allowing cold and starvation to weaken encircled German forces before attacking minimized Soviet casualties. They used variations of the Stalingrad strategy repeatedly in subsequent operations, encircling and destroying German forces across the Eastern Front. The memorialization of Stalingrad in Germany has been complicated by the uncomfortable facts surrounding the battle. German military tradition values courage and sacrifice, and the soldiers at Stalingrad certainly displayed both. But the battle also illustrated catastrophic leadership failures by Hitler and by the High Command, and it illustrated the futility of continuing to fight a war that was already lost. Post-war German commemorations of Stalingrad have struggled to honor the soldiers' sacrifice, while acknowledging that the sacrifice was wasted through leadership failures. The survivors' organizations that formed after the war focused on remembering comrades and on providing mutual support, but they also increasingly criticized the leadership decisions that had created the catastrophe. The Soviet and Russian memorialization of Stalingrad has been extensive, because the battle holds central place in Russian World War II memory. The Battle of Stalingrad is viewed as the turning point of the war, the moment when the Soviet Union stopped German advance and began pushing Germans back toward ultimate defeat. Memorials, museums, monuments, and commemorations in Volgograd, Stalingrad's current name, preserve the memory of the battle as Soviet-Russian victory and as symbol of resistance to invasion. The German suffering during the battle is acknowledged in these memorializations, but is framed as consequence of fascist aggression and as justified result of German invasion. The personal testimonies from survivors of the Freeze Night, collected through interviews and memoirs in decades after the war, provide harrowing details about the experience of extreme cold and about the psychological impact of watching friends freeze to death. Survivors describe the progression of hypothermia. First, the uncontrollable shivering, then the confusion and disorientation, then the paradoxical feeling of warmth that made victims want to remove clothing, then the loss of consciousness and death. They described the sound of the wind and the terrible silence when someone stopped breathing. They described the morning after when they had to count the dead and had to leave frozen bodies sitting where they had died because moving them was impossible. They described the guilt of surviving when so many died, the randomness that seemed to determine who lived and who froze, and the recurring nightmares about cold that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The medical analysis of the Freeze Night casualties indicates that most deaths were from severe hypothermia, with contributing factors including starvation-induced weakness, dehydration, and pre-existing wounds or illnesses. Hypothermia death occurs when core body temperature drops below approximately 28 degrees Celsius. At that point, the heart rhythm becomes irregular, and cardiac arrest occurs. The process is accelerated by factors including wind, wet clothing, lack of food, and prior exposure to cold. The German soldiers at Stalingrad had all of these risk factors. They were chronically malnourished. They were exhausted. Many had previous frostbite injuries that reduced circulation. Their clothing was inadequate and often wet from snow, and they had been exposed to severe cold for weeks before the worst night. Their bodies had no reserves left to fight the cold. When temperatures dropped to -42 with strong winds, their bodies simply could not generate enough heat to survive. The comparison between German cold casualties at Stalingrad and cold casualties in other winter warfare situations illustrates that the Stalingrad disaster was exceptional rather than inevitable result of winter warfare. Finnish forces fighting the Soviet Union during the Winter War of 1939–40 operated in comparable temperatures, but suffered much lower rates of cold casualties because they had proper winter equipment, adequate supplies, and training in winter survival. German forces earlier in the war, during the winter of 1941–42, had suffered significant cold casualties, but not on the scale of Stalingrad, because they were not encircled and cut off from supplies. Soviet forces throughout the war operated effectively in winter conditions because of better equipment and preparation. The Stalingrad freeze casualties resulted from the specific combination of encirclement, supply failure, inadequate equipment, malnutrition, and leadership failures that created uniquely lethal conditions. The ethical questions about responsibility for the freeze night deaths focus primarily on Hitler's decision to forbid breakout and on Göring's false promise about air supply. These decisions created the conditions where mass death from cold became inevitable. Lower-level commanders, including Paulus, bear some responsibility for continuing to obey orders that were clearly leading to disaster, but their options were limited by military culture that severely punished disobedience and by the reality that breakout had become impossible by the time the situation was clearly hopeless. The ordinary soldiers who froze to death bore no responsibility for their fate. They were following orders. They were trapped by circumstances beyond their control, and they died because their leadership had failed them catastrophically. The technological dimensions of the disaster include the failure of German equipment in extreme cold. Vehicles would not start because oil and fuel froze. Weapons jammed because mechanisms froze. Radios failed because batteries died in the cold. Aircraft engines would not start or would fail shortly after takeoff. The German military had not designed its equipment for sustained operations in extreme cold because it had not expected to be fighting in Russia during winter. The lack of cold weather equipment contributed directly to the disaster by leaving German forces unable to operate effectively even before the freeze night killed thousands. The logistical impossibility of supplying an encircled army by air in winter conditions was demonstrated catastrophically at Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe required approximately 500 tons of supplies delivered daily to sustain the Sixth Army. Delivering this tonnage would have required approximately 150 to 200 transport aircraft flights per day, assuming each aircraft delivered 3 tons and assuming no losses. The Luftwaffe never had close to that many transport aircraft available, and losses to Soviet fighters, to weather, and to accidents quickly reduced the available transport fleet. Even in good weather, the Luftwaffe managed perhaps 100 tons delivered on best days. During storms like the one on January 8–9, no flights were possible at all. The arithmetic of aerial supply was always impossible, but Göring's promise convinced Hitler that holding the pocket was feasible when it was actually a death sentence for the army trapped inside. The historical debates about Stalingrad continue among military historians and among Russians and Germans trying to understand what the battle means for their nation's histories. For Russians, Stalingrad is unambiguous victory and turning point in the war, demonstrating Soviet resilience and military capability. For Germans, Stalingrad is more complex, simultaneously a story of soldiers' courage and suffering, a story of catastrophic leadership failure, and a story of the consequences of aggressive war and of following a genocidal regime. The debates reflect different national memories and different attempts to find meaning in a battle that killed over 1 million people, and that represented one of history's bloodiest and most brutal military campaigns. The Freeze Night of January 8-9, 1943, stands as perhaps the single worst non-combat loss of life in military history. 20,000 soldiers dying from cold in one night exceeds the losses at most major battles. The deaths were not inevitable results of combat. They were direct consequence of leadership decisions that left soldiers without adequate supplies, shelter, or equipment in extreme winter conditions. The deaths were preventable if Hitler had authorized breakout, if Göring had not made false promises about aerial supply, if German forces had been adequately prepared for winter operations, or if someone in the chain of command had possessed the courage to disobey orders that were clearly leading to catastrophe. None of these things happened, and 20,000 men froze to death in one night as a result. Klaus Weber lived until 1989, dying at age 83 in Munich. He never fully recovered from his Stalingrad experience. His last recorded interview, given in 1985 to a German documentary filmmaker, included his description of the freeze night. "I remember the cold more than anything. Not the fighting, not the fear of being killed by Russians, just the cold. It was cold that killed most of us. We froze because we had been abandoned, because nobody was coming to rescue us, because Hitler would not let us try to escape. We knew we were going to die, and there was nothing we could do about it. I survived by accident. Many better men than me died that night. I've never understood why I lived, and they died. The cold was absolute. It was like hell, except hell is supposed to be hot. Our hell was frozen." Weber's testimony, along with testimonies from other survivors, provides the historical record of what occurred during that terrible night, and ensures that the deaths are not forgotten even as the generation that experienced them passes away. The legacy of the Stalingrad freeze night extends beyond the immediate casualties to influence how military forces prepare for winter operations and how they think about the ethics of command decisions that put soldiers at risk. Modern military doctrine emphasizes that commanders have responsibility to avoid exposing troops to unnecessary risks, and that logistics and supply are fundamental requirements that must be secured before committing forces to operations. The Stalingrad disaster illustrates what happens when these principles are violated, when forces are committed without adequate logistics, when impossible situations are not acknowledged, and when commanders value political or symbolic objectives over soldiers' lives. The lessons remain relevant because similar situations continue to occur in warfare, where inadequate preparation, poor logistics, or political interference with military decisions create conditions where soldiers die unnecessarily. The commemoration of the freeze night specifically, as distinct from commemoration of the Stalingrad battle generally, has been limited because the specific night tends to be subsumed into the broader disaster. Historians document the night's casualties as part of the overall casualty count for the pocket, but there are no monuments specifically to those who froze on January 8-9, as opposed to those who died on other nights or who died in combat. The specificity of the freeze night matters because it illustrates the degree to which cold was killing factor, and because the concentration of deaths in single night demonstrates how vulnerable the trapped army had become. Future historical work on Stalingrad continues to discover new details and new perspectives as archives are opened and as new generations of historians analyze the evidence. Recent Russian scholarship has provided access to Soviet planning documents and operational reports that illuminate Soviet decision-making during the battle. Recent German scholarship has analyzed individual unit records and personal documents that provide ground-level perspective on what soldiers experienced. The freeze night will remain part of this historical record as one of the most tragic episodes of a battle that was filled with tragedy. A night when the cold accomplished what Soviet forces had been unable to accomplish through weeks of combat, killing tens of thousands of German soldiers in a matter of hours.